Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today to have Tim invoking theism, and we're going to talk about my debate with Captain Dadpool. What's up, Tim?
What's up, man?
Super pumped. So we're just going to kind of free flow. What the heck am I saying? Just free flow through this conversation, just talking about the points and the subpoints. And if you didn't know, I had a debate recently with Captain Dadpool on Does God Exist? It's linked down below on the Atheist Network Group. So yeah, it's just a really interesting debate. So Tim and I are just going to come on and talk about it. So yeah, Tim, do you have anything you want to say as we get started here?
No, man. Overall, man, I think that I think it's cool that you've been doing more debates, like I've told you, and people seeing you do more debates and put yourself out there and stuff like that. Especially going into the Lion's Den because you are going on to the it's an atheist channel that you went on to. So just doing all that, I thought that the debate was interesting, but I think you definitely killed it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk through the debate. We're going to go through the openings, talk about the rebuttals and the cross exams, and then there's not really much beyond that. So we'll start with the openings. I do want to say, at the beginning, as always, a lot of respect to Captain Dadpool, and hopefully, this isn't to try to be like, oh, I won this or he won that, but more in terms of just adding on and furthering the discussion from the conversation that happened there. But with the openings, at least for me, when I went into this, I was just trying to do something different, because I think a lot of times if you look up a debate on does God exist, you're gonna find someone like William Lane Craig or Frank Turek, and they kind of use the kalam and the fine tuning and try to conclusively show that God exists. And I've become increasingly more in favor of a Swinburnian approach, and Swinburne hasn't done popular level debates in 20-minute openings and whatnot. So I try to kind of formulate that, looking at simplicity and explanatory power. So yeah, I don't know where you're gonna take it, Tim.
Yeah, man, and that's the main part, which is I find it funny that that what you're doing is you're taking rigorous, sophisticated philosophy built on by people like Swinburne and things, and even other natural theologians such as Draper and Sobel use a very similar method to Swinburne, and you're bringing that out there because people like Godless Engineer, people like Captain Dadpool, whether they like it or not, I mean, these aren't philosophically rigorous, sophisticated people when it comes to atheism and overall trying to defeat theism and showing that theism is false. And so you're taking someone like Swinburne, who on both sides of the aisle, atheists and theists all agree, and agnostics all agree that Swinburne either has the greatest piece of natural theology or is one of the greatest natural theologians in his whole cumulative case and his whole approach. And so it's cool to see you try to take that, condense it down, and then try to fit as much of that in as possible into a debate format. Because that's the hard thing about Swinburne is if you're gonna do his method, it's not very much tailored for debates.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting seeing you do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Christians and atheists are like when I first got interested in philosophy and apologetics and stuff like this, I wasn't exposed to Swinburne's case for God. I didn't really read The Existence of God until The Summer by Swinburne, and I'd been interested in this stuff for a year or two, a couple of years at this point. And it's just because I think his stuff isn't as accessible because it's very technical. What he does compared to someone like Craig, who has a very, very accessible. The column is very simple to understand, and I don't think those arguments are bad. I just think when we're trying to make a conversation, trying to argue for God's existence, I just prefer a Swinburnian kind of approach. So at least for me, I focused on simplicity and showing that theism is simpler, and then explanatory power, just showing the world looks more like we expect if God exists than if God doesn't exist. But you added a point when we were talking on the phone, Tim, about something else that could have been added that I didn't do but would have been helpful. So maybe you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and I think this is why, this is the advantages of Swinburne and the merits of Swinburne versus a Craigian apologetic. Now, of course, we all love Craig. We all have to give Craig the honorable mention, but just giving a bunch of deductive arguments, calling it a cumulative case, really isn't. It's not as fruitful, and it only goes so far. And just like we see in that type of apologetic, you just give a bunch of arguments, and that hardly really does much on either side. And so one thing for someone like Swinburne is he assesses theism as a grand theory, an ultimate theory, in a way that's relevantly similar to how we assess scientific theories. And so his assessment is in accordance with the philosophy of science. And in accordance with the philosophy of science, then he is going to look at two components of theories. Intrinsic probability and explanatory power, or what you want to call posterior probability, when all total evidence has been taken into account. So the intrinsic probability is, put simply, the probability of a hypothesis prior to looking at any evidence. It's also called a prior probability. I prefer to call it intrinsic probability because intrinsic probability is looking at the theory as a whole, and instead of focusing on like background knowledge, really it's our background assumptions about the theory. How coherent is it? How simple is it? And different ways of assessing intrinsic probability. How modest is it? That's one that Draper uses. He uses the principle of modesty. And this is going to show us how probable a hypothesis is before we at all look at any evidence. And a good way to kind of think about it is, shout out to August and Ben Watkins from Really Theology for putting this analogy out there, but you kind of think about it as a starting line during a race, and a theory that is, or hypothesis that is more intrinsically probable than another is going to start up farther up on the starting line than its rival. And so you can think about the intrinsic probability that way. And so if you're looking at a hypothesis that is less intrinsically probable, then what's going to happen is it's going to need to gain on its rival via explanatory power, being able to explain more or something like that. And this is really where it gets into is theory comparison. And this is something that's becoming more prevalent in the philosophy of religion. Someone like Graham Oppy has really been pushing this. Graham Oppy doesn't use arguments. He says it's very rare that you come upon a good argument for anything. So we should just be sticking to comparing theories. And I do agree with him on that. Many theists don't, but I am in line. I think that comparing theories is the right way to go. And when you're doing theory comparison, then you're comparing the explanatory virtues and merits of such theories. And so intrinsic probability is a very important part of that, because this is what you look at before it's explanatory power. And this is going to, as we continue on in this conversation and in this review, we're going to see actually how much like something like intrinsic probability is going to play into a lot of the back and forth and assumptions made by Dadpool in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this would be a good time to talk about like my rebuttal, and then with regards to like his opening. So his opening was interesting because he didn't, and like I'm not disappointed. I just like he didn't have like a very clear like he didn't do like deductive arguments or anything like that. He just kind of showed like, I think he was just trying to just like point to certain phenomena that seemed like very surprising if God exists, like maybe like animal suffering or divine hiddenness, and like just trying to point these as like marks against theism, which is interesting because there weren't really many. I wouldn't say that, but it's just like that was kind of like what he got. So yeah, do you want to say anything here with like his opening and where we went from there?
Yeah, as I was listening to his opening, what I was trying to hone in on is, okay, I'm like, what are the arguments he's making? And what is the particular method? What is the particular approach that Dadpool is employing here to show the implausibility of theism, right? And I don't know, is he a lack theist, or does he think that atheism can be defended?
I don't know exactly
he
where
sounded ambiguous in the debate, like going back between like atheism doesn't need to explain anything versus like theism's not a good explanation.
I don't know exactly where he would be on that kind of scale.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to treat it how he would in philosophy of religion and say that basically his defense of atheism here is was had some disclarity and some ambiguity to it, because like I said, I'm trying to see like what's the method, what's the approach being used, and what are the arguments. Because if you look at other theologians like Draper and things, he has a very specific approach. Oppie, he has a very specific approach in how he shows that naturalism overall fares better than theism. Draper shows that naturalism has more predictive power than theism, etc. And they employ different ways and methodologies in doing so. What I found with Dadpool is really just a long case of anomaly mongering, and I hate to just kind of put it that way, because anomaly mongering is something that happens when and I've talked about it with you on here before. It happens when someone brings up, let's say, some tension in a theory, something that might be surprising or prima facie unexpected, and then basically just mongers it, like, why, well, you have this theory, but then there's this data here, how does your theory deal with it? And that's basically what we got. It seems so surprising, it seems so unexpected, this seems like a problem, and just basically mongering that it's a problem, that there's just some anomalous data on theism. But I didn't get an argument. I didn't get, okay, and therefore theism's implausible, because the anomalies come in different, I guess you could say, different stripes, right? All theories, no matter what, have anomalies, but not on all anomalies on all theories are disconfirming and render it implausible. So he would have to bridge that gap by showing us something like, like a natural evil is something that theism couldn't ever account for in a non-ad hoc manner, isn't something that theism has the resources for accounting for, and is something that is actually confirmation of atheism, because atheism can account for it in XYZ ways. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't even kind of get him even going into how atheism does it. He just kind of showed, am I right? Like,
so I think what his approach was, like, thinking about Ricky, and I could be wrong, so I'd encourage you, anyone, just like listen to the debate to make sure, like, to actually know, like, Ricky's what he's saying. But like, from what I got out of it is he was looking at certain anomalies, say like minimal suffering or divine hiddenness, or like the incoherence of God. And he said, like, given these phenomena, it's just, I think what he's implying is that it's just unlikely that God exists, because we wouldn't expect these things if he did. So that's what I got out of it, basically.
He brought up indifference, because he quoted Dawkins, and he said at bottom is blind. This is what we expect if there's blind indifference. And then he quoted, I think, was it Stenger or somebody who said that?
Quoted Schellenberg at one point, but I don't know if that's the quote you're thinking of.
No, because then he went into the science and basically quoted that the universe runs in a way where we don't have to invoke God and things of that sort. So he did kind of give that positive case a little bit, where he showed how these things lead to atheism. But like I said, I'm trying to act in good faith here, trying to be charitable here. I didn't get necessarily an argument or something that shows how atheism as a theory can actually outdo theism in this way, besides just asserting that these things are anomalies, and therefore this is a problem on theism, therefore theism is implausible. So that's really what we got, and I mean, that's not very satisfying as a case for atheism, really.
It was definitely something interesting, which it kind of played into my strategy. We can just talk about the rebuttals if you have anything to add, because, like, at least for me, like, when I listened to his opening, I was like, okay, well, here's a bunch of things where he says theism just can't explain these certain phenomena, or it seems unlikely they could explain these certain phenomena. So for me, I was like, okay, well, let's just give an explanation for these things from a theistic perspective, and then I just listed off like all the potential explanations in my mind. So do you have anything to add with regards to the rebuttal section?
Yeah, I mean, it's even unclear to me if he was even making incompatibility arguments,
Mm-hmm.
or if he was making evidential arguments of the probabilistic type, saying that theism may be able to have explanations and answers, but prima facie atheism. This is much more. These facts are much more likely on atheism,
Yeah.
less surprising on atheism. Um, because people speak in a particular language, and it's hard to see whether or not they're saying it's incompatible, like a logical problem of evil, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
these two propositions in conjunction with one another, just render like this is an incompatibility on theism, or whether or not like he's yeah, that like that's what I was trying to pinpoint. I didn't really get to see that. It was just seemed like, well, this is a problem on theism,
Mm-hmm.
and then somehow it's not a problem on atheism, and then so continue like, so that's what I was looking for, right, type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super good. And I don't have too much else to add with like the rebuttal section because it's very brief. And then we got into the cross exams, which was super interesting. And I think that's where we covered a lot of stuff. So you could just start talking about the cross exams.
Yeah, um so what's really interesting um is when you were kind of showing him how you're approaching evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And this seemed to be something that was very much something he was really expecting, because he did claim that there just is no evidence for God. And see Joe Schmidt and Cameron Bertuzzi on the no evidence mantra. Joe does a very good job of showing via Bayesian confirmation theory that this is just a really bad thing that amateur theologians um, parrot all the time,
Mm-hmm.
which is that there is just no evidence. And it's just interesting when you wonder, like, okay, like, I like how you pointed out. You're like, what do you mean by evidence?
Mm-hmm.
And some people say, well, maybe your standard evidence is too high. I don't even go there. I'm like, what do you mean by evidence? Because if you're meaning like a, a knockdown philosophical proof, like, well, none of us have that. You can't give that to me. I can't give that to you. If you're talking about empirical evidence, like that of physics, like that of biology, well, that just gets this whole thing wrong, which he did, in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that he misunderstood what kind of explanation theism actually is.
Mm-hmm.
He's treating theism as an alternative hypothesis to science, and he's implicitly treating science as favor of atheism. That's just flat wrong, and there is no justification that is ever given. That's a big blunder on his part for why that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying
I
that
do want to interrupt here just very briefly because it's funny because like I was reading Swinburne's like shorter book on the existence of God, just thinking about this debate, and he answers this objection of like theism is just like the science stopper. It's like the explanation, like when science can't explain something, and like Swinburne's like, whoa, like we're getting this wrong. Like he's like in my hypothesis, like the theistic explanation is like the explanation of why we can do science in the first place. Just kind of like setting up like what theism actually trying to explain. So I just wanted to
right, yeah, exactly. Because what they're trying to get at is they're trying to say that atheism, in some way, including, I'm thinking more in terms of naturalism, but I'll go with just atheism as broadly, precludes theism. And so theism is going to have to work really, really hard to match atheism as explanations. Well, they're scientific ones. This is a big problem. The reason why this is a big problem is that it goes back to this whole idea of how do we assess theories.
Mm-hmm.
Theism and atheism are rival theories, meaning that there's no default null hypothesis here. We're both bringing to the table a set of commitments, a set of ways of looking at facts, and then we're comparing and trading off the explanatory virtues and merits of either theories, and then saying, okay, well, then letting that determine our choice. One is just not simply is able to get a preclusion simply by saying like, well, we have science, right? And that gets into two problems. The first problem is intrinsic probability. The only way to get a preclusion in a rival hypotheses comparison is to show that one is more intrinsically probable than the other, which he didn't do. But which you did try to do. You try to do that via simplicity. I think your defense of simplicity via given the amount of time you had to explicate it was very good. By showing arbitrary limits, and of course, bringing in Doherty and Swinburne, talking about two properties held in the simplest way possible, in conjunction with one another, and how atheism had to posit all these different things. You are showing that, hey, well, if theism has a gain on intrinsic probability over atheism is going to have to work really hard to outdo theism in terms of its explanation, in terms of its explanatory power, in terms of its predictive success. And he didn't show that atheism was more intrinsically probable than theism. He did make a couple comments about how it's more complicated because you have all these intentions, you have to posit in things and whatnot. And a really defended version of that argument is by Gregory Dawes. But I think that even in its strongest form, that argument fails because the theist isn't actually having to posit and build into theism all these different intentions. And Swinburne, the way he explicates his defense, doesn't do that either. He shows how you can derive those things. So the only way that he could really say that atheism precludes theism at all is by showing it's more intrinsically probable, but he did not do that. The second thing is that if you're going to say that all of atheism's explanations are scientific explanations, if we look at these again in accordance with philosophy of science, that means that you're having to build in whole scientific theories into your model at the get-go. So your theoretical content is all of science to explain everything. Okay, so now what you've done is you have just blown out your priors completely. Meaning that before we even assess your explanatory power, theism is just automatically much more intrinsically probable because you're positing, at least, remind me again, did you go with perfection or did you go with, how did you formulate your hypothesis?
I define God as a perfect mind that created the universe.
Okay. Yeah, right. So if our theoretical content is perfection, that involving mind, and a disposition to create and things of that sort, that has some relatively lean conceptual content in there. And even if we let's say take perfection and then jot down all the different perfections, and see that, right? You're going to have some content there. But then if you take what he's doing and saying, well, it's all of science is atheism's explanations, and he's building that into his theory, well, then his theoretical content is going to be all of biology, everything chemistry says, everything physics says, everything astronomy says. I mean, every single natural science and everything it has in its conceptual content is not in his theory. This is so much more complex than theism. That is a loss on simplicity. That is a loss on modesty. And it's a coherent, but that's a theoretical cost on his view. So it's actually not an advantage for him to do such a thing. And so I want to hit on this too, which is this is something that Sean Carroll did in his debate with Craig. Like just because something isn't explained by science, even though he didn't say explicitly that he's building anything in, but just because something is explained by science doesn't lend atheism any explanatory power, nor does it vitiate theism's explanatory power. And going into what Carroll did, Carroll in his debate with Craig pointed to a graph and he said, see these graphs? He said, this is what we see in the physics papers. But but do we see these graphs in the theological papers? He said no. And that is really interesting to me because him as a scientist, I'm not saying that scientists, study a bunch of philosophy of science through science, but as a scientist, as a cosmologist, he thinks that the data of physics is just automatic confirmation of naturalism. And that theists are having their own version of science over here, right? And that's just gets it wrong. Like that's not the type of explanation theism is. Swinburne. I mean, it just helps if people just read Swinburne. Like, come on. Like Swinburne, he talks about how he delineates between personal and scientific explanation, or explanations in terms of initial conditions and laws of nature, and explanations in terms of the intentions and desires of a person, right? And that these things are not incompatible. They're not mutually exclusive. They often complement one another, and they give different explanations. So when you want to ask the question, well, what is the explanations of the laws of nature themselves? Well, you can't provide a scientific explanation for that because science explains things in terms of the laws. I call them law-governed explanations. So if you want an explanation of the nomological structure and order, well, then you're going to have to give an explanation. The only other explanation you really have on the table is it can't be more order because, like I said, then that's just a circular explanation. That's not a further non-circular one. If you want a further non-circular one, it's going to have to be in terms of mind. It's going to have to be in terms of reason, a reason-governed explanation, which is what the theistic explanation is. Because he did critique, he did a couple of times really charge you with the fallacy of God of the gaps. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so it was interesting because I brought up consciousness at one point, showing that trying to argue that well, if something like idealism is true, it's a simpler theory than anything the atheist can have on hand, unless they want to also be an idealist, which is interesting. So with that, you kind of said well, we're gonna explain consciousness, and we're 20 years away or 30 years away, something what he said, and I was just confused with what he meant by that. So I just asked him.
We both were.
And then so he never specifically accused me of saying God of the gaps, but I think he was expecting me to do more of a Craigian kind of approach. We're saying well, atheism can explain the beginning of the universe or the fine tuning or objective moral facts. So we have these not demonstrations, but sound arguments that, if true, show conclusively that God exists. And that's just not what I was doing. So I think that was kind of, and this kind of method that at least I used is not there's not many people using this kind of method. So I understand if he wasn't familiar with it, because it's not everyone's using this kind of style of argument. Yeah.
I mean, even if no theist is making God of the gaps arguments except for a creationist. So even on the charge from Craig, that wouldn't even work in the first place. He did specifically say God of the gaps because I heard him say something like, that sounds like a God of the gaps argument.
Okay.
He said we're so close to we're almost there explaining it, and again, I just, it was just interesting to hear him say that we're so close to explaining consciousness. He didn't even expound on what he meant by how what he means. You talk about you talk about we're so close to solving the hard problem.
This is why exactly why I'm a fan of Swinburne's approach is because let's just say he's I mean, I don't know if he's so behind his position, but let's say he's right. In 20 years, we found a physical solution to consciousness. Fine. For my argument, that's not really a problem, because I'm not saying that well, physicalism must be false, so theism must be true. It's more just saying that the existence of conscious moral agents is more expected on theism than atheism. I still think that's true, even if physicalism is true. So that's why I'm a fan of the Swinburnian approaches. I don't have to rely on defending things that just seem unnecessary for the sake of the debate.
Yeah, you weren't making a cosmic consciousness argument. You weren't and explaining consciousness is such a different topic because that goes into ontology. That's issues. You have so many different theories of consciousness out there that for him to just assert that physicalism, because when he says explain consciousness, we know that he means physicalism.
Well,
that
I think he's
physicalism,
agnostic on. I don't think he's a physical, because I asked him at some point in the debate. I'm like, "Are you a physicalist?" He's like, "I don't know." So I think I would say that he clarified later in the debate.
yeah, okay, yeah. So then, yeah, he's just not being clear when he says that we're so close to explaining consciousness. Because I would say that, like you're saying, like it's not really, it's relevant to God, but like we're not positing God and explaining, like, oh, God's like doing something in the brain with consciousness or whatever. Like, I'm an idealist. Like everything exists within consciousness. There is no hard problem. So if you call that we've explained consciousness, then you can do that or whatever. But so that's just a lot of disclarity there. But yeah, I mean, it just goes into like, what does it mean for a theistic explanation? Because it goes back into how you're approaching evidence. That in Bayesian, standard Bayesian confirmation theory, and this is what the top atheologians, most sophisticated ones, are doing and using in how they assess theism versus atheism, is they look at evidence in terms of degrees of support, something that raises or increases our confidence in a hypothesis being true, or something that raises the probability, the likelihood of a hypothesis. So if there's some fact that, when the hypothesis is invoked and it allows us to go, okay, this is actually much more likely and less surprising in things expected. If the hypothesis was true, then that's some evidence in favor of that hypothesis. Now, this evidence doesn't have to be in terms of an entailment or a prediction. Doesn't have to make it highly probable, but it just has to make it more likely than its competitor. This is why we're doing rival hypotheses comparison. If you take theism and atheism, take, for example, fine-tuning, and Luke Barnes says this, like, fine-tuning might not even be so ultra probable on theism, but relative to naturalism, it's much more probable on theism. And this is what they do with evidential arguments from evil. And so if you have that idea of evidence there, then I like how you press them on it. Like, okay, well, don't you think what example did you use in terms of, you tried to get him to concede some evidence for theism? What example did you use?
I think I was focused mostly on like the more like embodied moral conscious agents. Was
right. Yeah,
just it's more expected on theism than atheism. If that's true, that'd be evidence for theism.
Right. Exactly. And the reason why it'd be evidence in favor of theism is because one, such facts are relevant, would be explained in a way that's relevant to God's own ontology. God is is goodness, is the foundations of morality, is supremely rational, and things of that sort. Well, then we have facts that resemble such, it has such an underlying ontology. And so already these facts will be much more expected and much more are much more friendly on theism. But not only that, is that theism gains explanatory power from God having these, what I call, value generating dispositions via God's goodness and knowledge, which I think you can just epistemically predict from the single property of perfection. And so God having these value generating dispositions, we can then actually target a range of world ensembles God might be expected to actualize. And it's going to be on the basis of value. Moral agents, embodied moral agents, are have great value. These are great things, agents in which can build themselves, develop their moral character, use their will to benefit others, is something that, one, like I said, is relevant to God's own ontology and is a very much valuable thing. So we can expect that God would do such an action. He would just see the goodness and act upon the goodness, because that's ultimately what God's goodness, via diffusion, goodness is diffusive of itself, it extends itself, it doesn't hold itself in. Well, you would expect God to do such a thing. Of course, there is issues of incommensurability, and and everything like that. But that's a whole different tangent and rabbit hole that we don't need to go down. But that's how we would assess evidence. And so, things like that are something that we'd say, yeah, this is evidence of theism. This is something that's just much more likely on theism than it is on atheism.
I think, at least for the rest of our time here, because we'll probably go about for like 15-ish more minutes, maybe just talk about the problem of natural evil, because it's like in the cross exams, this was the point I felt not prepared for, which was interesting because like I tried to like build like a rough sketch of like the soul building theodicy with regards to like extending it to natural evil, but I didn't really do as well as I hoped. I wasn't prepared, and Ricky did a good job presenting the argument. So I don't know. Do you want to start here, Tim, and I can kind of add some stuff with regards to where we go here?
Sure. Yeah, man. So yeah, as far as natural / like evolutionary evils, evils, I like saying evils. Like Evo Devo, but evil.
Yeah, we stayed away from the evolutionary evil stuff. It was more just like he talked about like, well, like why is there like hurricanes to wipe out? Like,
he brought hurricanes, and he brought like mass extinction events. I just plopped that into evolutionary evils category because that's what's always brought up. It kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, which was like simply asking why such evils occur if like theism is true, and just simply posing it as a problem doesn't actually establish that there really is a problem here. Like I said, it just collapses into like mere anomaly mongering. It's like, hey, look at this anomaly. This is a problem on theism. Don't you see this is a problem? And then it's like, okay, well, like what's the argument? Like what's your conclusion? And he asks a lot of questions, and like Cameron Bertuzzi says, like it's good to ask questions, but like simply posing a question doesn't make an argument. So like, what are the beliefs and that you're putting down, and what do you think is the conclusion that follows from them, et cetera, and so forth. I'm not gonna deny that there's like some natural tension that we like just perceive, but I mean that doesn't really show that theism is implausible. You have to make that connection. And the same thing, like I find it interesting because you could ask the same thing of atheism. Like, why isn't there, because he said this is not the design or creation that was such a perfect being to create. A lot of assumptions on what God values there. Because remember, God explains things via what God values, what the value that God sees. And so you can ask on atheism, okay, like, well, why isn't there so much more suffering? And why is there so much more disorder all the time than we currently observe? I mean, surely there could be plenty more horrendous evils that result in just the vitiation of millions of psyches all the time. Like no one ever triumphs over their evils and things of that sort. Like that is much more of an indifferent universe than the one that he says that this one is. So you can make that argument too. Like you can symmetrically put that there, and it doesn't really solve anything, right? So I mean, again, like theories have anomalies, and simply pointing out that they have anomalies doesn't, establish that there's an implausibility here or disconfirmation here. This is what creationists do with evolution. They show certain apparent anomalies on evolution, and they show like, oh, you guys said that evolution is this gradual, stepwise process, but then, you can't account for this over here because, 9 different type of phyla, in this explosion event happened, and that just shows that there have to be some infusion of information there. Evolution doesn't have that, or whether this is a problem for you guys. Take our explanation, and it's simply going. How does evolution account for that? How does evolution account for that? And it's the same thing that creationists do with evolutionary theory, and so. In the same way, evolutionary biologists are within their epistemic rights of retaining their theory of evolution by simply going into their resources and the tools that they can take and derive from evolutionary theory and come up with explanations. For example, like explanations of vestigial organs, and showing that, we would expect that at some time these were useful, and now they're not so useful anymore, and things adapt, things change. This is very consonant on evolution. And we have these explanations, right? And these are not ad hoc explanations, not simply just put out there to patch up the theory and to save your favored theory, but to show that, given my theory, what are some plausible explanations I can derive from here? And that's basically what theodicies are. And so evolution just like theism, I think is a successful a progressive research program, meaning that it's durable, it's explanatorily flexible in the sense that it's able to account for further evidence, new evidence, and it is able to stand the test of time, right? And it's able to be malleable in a way that allows it to follow certain paradigm shifts if they occur, right? Which we're currently seeing in certain fields. So this is just something that, philosophy of science is very aware of. There's literature on this. This is very much a normal thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I think, you mind if I go? Or you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I think that's a good starting point looking at this of like, this is something I didn't ask when we were on this point, but like, you talked about like anomaly mongering versus like looking at like what would be like strong evidence. So I think this is like anomaly mongering is just because Jonah asked this in the chat. It's just like, I think of anomaly mongering is just like trying to pick a hole in a theory, whereas like pointing out strong discriminating evidence is when you're building like a rival theory to try to like and saying like say like I have this like necessary initial state and like this is what we'd expect. Like seeming like it's like some different suffering maybe on this theory, maybe whereas wouldn't on like the theistic one, maybe it's like a more sophisticated argument you can make. But yeah, with regards to like the natural evil point, one of the things I was trying to get at was this Swinburne quote I have put up here with regards to like natural evil, where he talks about in the existence of God. I think the shorter version where he says, particularly natural evil such as physical pain gives the sufferer a choice, whether to endure it with patience or whether to bemoan his lot. His friend can choose whether to show sympathy toward the sufferer or whether to be callous. The pain makes possible these choices, which would not otherwise exist. There is no guarantee that the action directed towards the pain will be good ones, but the pain gives the agents the opportunity to perform good actions. The good or bad actions which we perform in the face of natural evil themselves provide opportunities for further choice of good or evil stances towards the former actions. So this is what I was trying to argue basically, is like the Swinburne point of like things such as hurricanes allow for like good or bad choices for like responders and whatnot, which can progress in like still building and whatnot. And the other thing I thought about was, and it skimmed me after the debate, I was like, I feel dumb not bringing this up, was like given theism, like I conceded that like for the person that dies in the hurricane, there's no soul building there. But like given theism, it seems like in like the afterlife, the person can use that suffering to soul build anyways. Like given like their death on this planet, that's not the end of soul building given theism. So I wouldn't concede that point anymore. So I just wanted to get in that and just get that out of my chest of like things I think in response, just reflecting on the conversation there.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you see these reflections. You're like, okay, well, this is some things I might want to add. These are the things I could have added and things that sort. Because I think that those are on the right track, especially showing how, if theism is actually able to predict or entail that there is an afterlife, then it does soften the blow of a lot of the things that he was saying. Yeah, so as far as that, a guy who asked anomaly mongering, so there's the paper. I don't know if you guys can see. That's not going to work. Yeah, Evil and the Problem of Anomaly. It's by Trent Doherty and Alexander Pruss. It's a 39-page paper on explicating everything I've talked about. So if you want to go read it for yourself, there is some math, there is some Bayesianism in here, and a lot of philosophy of science being explicated in this, but it's very important. It'll help you in your understanding of how scientific paradigm shifts happen, how theories are durable and explanatorily flexible. And so, and you can see how this is really all creationists do with their arguments, is that they pretty much just anomaly monger, and then pose their own ad hoc explanations for why things occur. And so, yeah, I mean, it's tricky to show, if something is truly disconfirming or not. That's just going to go into, how you're going to do your theory comparison, right? It's all going to depend on that method. Yeah. So I want to say one thing. I want to say that, like, it just goes back into, like, trying to understand the argument that Dadpool is putting forth, because, like, like that's like if you take like a William Rowe style argument from like gratuitous evil and suffering, like, like he has some very explicit premises. Like, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent being could have prevented without thereby preventing the occurrence of any greater good. Omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so, thereby preventing the occurrence of some greater good. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being, right? We have some premises here, some things that seem to show, okay, then this cannot be true on theism, right? Given, well, the facts of gratuitous suffering, right? And so I think something like that, if he would have been more explicit on those things, then you guys could have actually had maybe more productive conversation about that. And so I think that ultimately, like, you know, he's asking also, like, you know, you said this noble law-like order, right, that God creates.
Yeah.
And then he said, you know, well, you have a tornado. You talked about, you know, imagine if the tornado just stopped. And he said, yeah, but, you know, then this tornado comes, it doesn't stop and it kills millions of people, right? And said, you know, why does God not create different laws and different, you know, natural occurrences that don't lead to that, right? And ultimately, the first thing I want to say is it's hard to tell, given his approach or his position, how he makes that data itself likely at all. And that why we should expect the kind of nomological order that we actually observe in the actual world on his atheism. And this is all this. I have a quote from Hick, and this is what Hick says about the kind of interventionist God idea, you know, that, you know, God should be intervening in all these situations, and that would be something that we would expect on theism. This is what he says. He says, no one could ever injure anyone else. The murderer's knife would turn to paper, or his bullets to thin air. The mountain climber, steeplejack, or playing child falling from a height would float unharmed to the ground. The reckless driver would never meet the disaster. There would be no need to work, since no harm could result from avoiding work. There would be no call to be concerned for others in time of need or danger, for in such a world there would be no real needs or dangers. One can at least begin to imagine such a world. It is evident that our present ethical concepts would have no meaning in it at all. And this is what Swinburne points out, which is if you really start to see some of the ways in which, like, you know, the nomological structure of the world actually affords us with kind of a moral arena in which moral agents can actually make significant moral choices, you start to see that things just start taking these things away. And you can have that kind of thought experiment, and you start to really see, like, whoa, like, we'd be living in, I mean, all the virtues that we could obtain would just be stripped from us, right? And this is ultimately what Doherty argues, which is he thinks that God would create a world that is saint-fostering. Saintliness, not in terms of just Christian saints, but like the virtues, the highest virtues, self-sacrifice, forgiveness, right? All the different major forms of love that someone could have would be stripped from our world if God were to simply step in all the time, right? And then it would just nullify why God created moral agents in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I want to add there.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's really good. We pretty much summarized everything. So we have just a couple minutes left. So do you have any last thoughts or anything you want to say with regards to this or anything else, Tim, before we wrap up?
The only thing I want to say is, if Dadpool, you know, if you have watched this and you've made it this far, end up watching this, I would say it's awesome that you're out there. You know, it seems that you're trying to seek the truth and things of that sort. The only thing I would say is I would have some encouragement for you to read a little deeper, raise the level of discourse in your life, man, and start looking into the works of Swinburne and Doherty, Proust, and reading those on evil, such as Marilyn McCord Adams, William Hasker, John Hick. These are, you know, really good, high-level, sophisticated sources on these things. I'm also reading, you know, the atheologians as well, such as like Mackey, J.L. Mackey, and Graham Oppie, and Paul Draper, and like Felipe Leon, and really starting to see like where the philosophy of religion is at on these different things, and start to see how theism and atheism are really being looked at and assessed. I'm sure it'll be a blessing to you and serve you in your own journey as well. And yeah, that's the only thing I'd say.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Ricky for agreeing to this debate, and to like Ricky or anyone else listening to this, like, I really hope that like when you listen to this video, you're not listening to like something where like we're trying to like foot stomp and be like, we won, look what we did, we got this guy speechless, bro, come on, we did this. Like, that's just like, in my mind, that's terrible debate reviews whenever I hear stuff like that. It's like, at least for me, like with Tim, we had a good conversation. I was like, this would be a really good chance to build a bridge and just kind of like elaborate and go further based on the context of the debate and just try to expand on ideas. So I hope you find that fruitful. The debate's probably not going to end up on my channel because there's just a lot of things that I don't want on our YouTube channel. So it's linked down below, so you can check it out on the Atheist Network Group. And yeah, it's a really valuable debate, and I really learned a lot. And very grateful for Tim to come on and give his thoughts and really help me in expanding my thinking. So yeah, thanks Tim for coming on. It's been so much fun.
It's been awesome.
And yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. Always, if you're new, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And then if you enjoy the channel, consider becoming a member or patron. Support us for as little as $1 a month. Your support means a lot. If you're listening via YouTube, you can just press the join button right now, and that means a lot. Just for as little as $1.99 a month. But yeah, one last time, Tim, thank you so much, man, for coming on. At Invoking Theism is linked on the YouTube title, so you can just check it out. Great content there. So yeah, thanks, Tim.
Thanks, man.
Awesome. Have a good one, guys, and God bless.